Next, we'll go over what's known as loops. So there's two kinds of loops. There's the for loop and the while loop. So first, I will go over the for loop, which is a little more common. So with the for loop, what you do is you declare a variable. So let's say int I, and then initially, well, we can leave it without a value for our for loop. And so there's three parts to a for loop. So we have our initial value. So typically what we do is we count from 0. And there's a reason for this. And once we maybe go into arrays and some other data structures, this will make more sense. But you typically in programming languages, you count from 0. So what we'll do is we'll say I equals 0. I is less than 10. And then we'll say I plus plus. And I'll explain what all of this means in a second. Let's just get a working version here. Oop. Okay, so this is the typical structure you'll see. And since we've started counting from 0, say we wanted to count 10 times, the usual structure is you count from 0. So you say I equals 0, and then you say while I is less than your number that you want to count to, and what'll happen is it'll reach 9, and then it'll test, and then it'll say when it reaches 10, that won't be true anymore, so it'll break out of the for loop. And then this is a special syntax here that you might may or may not remember, where you do I plus plus. And what that'll do is you do the variable name and you do plus plus, and that'll increment the variable by 1. And that's a special syntax because incrementing by 1 and counting is such a common thing in programming that it's included directly in the language. And so as you can see here, counting 0 all the way to 9, we've gone through 10 numbers. And I hope that makes sense to everybody what's going on. So this'll, you'll reach a point if you go on to do more programming, you won't even think about this anymore. You'll say I equals 0, I equals the number of times I want to loop, and then I plus plus, and it's a very common thing. And it'll make more sense maybe as we get into the course more why you would use a for loop. You typically have some number of times you want to execute something. So for example, say you've got a program that you have somebody enter their password, and then you have this loop that they enter the password and they've entered it incorrectly so many times based on this number here. And then once they reach that number without correctly entering their password, the program will just exit. So that's a typical usage. There's a million other uses. You'll see them once we get into pointers and arrays, and there's a million other reasons for needing loops. And it makes the code a lot more compact. If you had to individually write an if statement 100 times, the code would be completely unmanageable. So that's how our for loop works. And just to note, maybe you may or may not have picked this up, one of the things that is typical in programming style, your program will still work. So C++ is a language that you can have spaces before and after your lines of code, and sometimes even in between. Like for the example, if we that piece of code would run the exact same. But what you do for readability is typically every time you have one of these curly braces, what's known as a block of code, you want to indent. And so there's different ways to indent. Tab or 4 spaces is pretty common. And that makes it so once you have large blocks of code with maybe 10 or 15 lines of code in each block, it makes it a lot more readable. So that's just, you may or may not have noticed that as I was typing. And in fact, once you're actually typing in Visual Studio, a lot of times, so if I hit enter, it'll automatically indent because that's such a common programming style. So let's move on to the kind of cousin of the for loop, which is the while loop. So in this one, we will do something similar, except for beforehand, we'll say I equals 0. And then the way this one works is while the condition inside of this is true, the loop will keep on going. So let's, as with our if statements, when we have these parentheses like that, we're usually looking for something to be evaluated inside those parentheses as either true or false. So let's say while I is less than 3, so this will actually execute 3 times. It'll execute while I equals 0, I equals 1, I equals 2, and then when I equals 3, 3 is not less than 3, it's equal to 3, so then our program will break out of that while loop. So we have our code here, and then we're going to print I with a new line after every single part of the loop. We start without debugging. Oh, okay, that's a bug. What we have to do is, and I guess this is good, I made this mistake to show you, if nothing changes in your while loop, it'll run forever. So what happened with that instance is we set I equals 0, I is less than 3, and then we print it. But every time this loop runs, I never changes. So every single time we run, I was always going to equal 0. So what we have to do is make I do something. And what our goal is to work toward making this condition satisfied. So what we're doing is every time we add 1 to I, we're eventually working toward this goal. And sometimes you may write a program where that goal is a lot more complicated than just adding the number 1 to a variable every single time, but many times you're not. Many times it's just you've got some sort of setup like this, and you're doing the same thing. And what you can notice is this is actually very similar to a for loop, and a for loop is just a little more compact way of writing a while loop, because this type of loop is so common that it's a little easier to read as a for loop. So let's go ahead and run this piece of code again, and as we can see, it ran 3 iterations. It ran 0, 1, and 2. Okay, so while we're on this subject, let me make one more note about comparisons. So right now we have I is less than 3. Well, let's do this instead. Let's do an exclamation point and then an equal sign. And so the way that one works is when you see exclamation points, that means not. It means the opposite. It means no. There's many ways you can describe it. But when you're reading this in English, you're saying while I doesn't equal 3, and then we have our stuff in the middle. And you'll see this exclamation point a lot, and there's a lot of different ways to use it. So I kind of want to introduce it, and maybe I should have mentioned it during the if statements, but this is as good a video as any. So we have it ran again as 0, 1, and 2. And so what the other lesson I guess we can pick up from is there's a lot of different ways to write the exact same program. So previously we had written I is less than 3, which is not the same as I isn't equal to 3, but as far as our program is concerned, it ran the exact same way. So code that does different things may have the exact same end result, even though they're technically not the same programs. So that's also something to keep in mind. As always, if anybody has any questions about this, or if there's any confusion, or if anybody maybe didn't understand the video, or I'm sorry, their COP 2000 the first time around, and this is a little confusing, go ahead and send me any questions you have, or if you need me to make any follow-up videos.